Hey guys, from the Thoughtful Gardener. I am so thrilled you're here. Today we're going to talk about natives, nativars, and cultivars and what's right for your garden. There is a school of thought out there that says you should only plant natives. In fact, you should just rip out your lawn and start fresh. I am not that gardener. My grandmother's peonies are happily coexisting with my native plants. But at the same time, I do think there is value in considering native plants for your garden, not only because they're super beneficial for wildlife, but if you ate today, thank a pollinator. 1 out of every 3 bites of food you take is courtesy of a pollinator. So we want to obviously feed those who are feeding us. And that then means that we should consider native plants for not only their ecological value, but in addition, their value in terms of being able to sustain themselves regardless of your weather. Because they were born in your backyards, it's very likely they will be likely to survive more climate disruptions. So you have a hot, dry summer or a long, cold winter or early damp spring. These plants really are adapted for all of those, especially if you're buying things that are what considered straight native plants. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what the research is saying related straight natives versus nativar versus cultivar. So let's maybe talk a little bit about definitions first. First of all, native plants are born in your geography. In other words, they were from here before we long existed, and likely they were not brought here from somewhere else. And so while this definition is constantly being updated, the reality is that these plants, especially if you're getting seeds or plants that are within 100 miles of where you live, are very likely to survive regardless of what you throw at it. Now, I will say that for the first 2 years, the plants do require water, so it's not that you can just put them in the ground and walk away. It's also really important to understand the site, because the type of soil you have and the type of light you have is going to be very important. And sometimes soil on properties just from a few feet can really vary. So you really need to understand what you're dealing with so you can give your plant the best chance of survival. But nativars were introduced because some of our native plants can get very tall. So for example, our native Joe Pye weed here in Pennsylvania can get 9 to 11 feet tall in the right conditions. For most people who live in a homeowners association like I do, it's probably a little tall for your garden. So nativars were introduced to be able to reduce the size of the plant, but not really change the characteristic of the flower nor change the leaf color. So what do pollinators prefer? Well, they prefer a flower that looks like initial flower. And that's why I think the Joe Pye weed nativar works, is because if you look at the flowers, they're very similar to the original plant. So little Joe is 5 to 7 feet, probably more apt for your garden. And now there's a new introduction called Baby Joe that I actually got from a grower 2 years ago. And I'm thrilled to tell you that in my own garden, I saw a lot of skippers on that plant this past year. So this was its first full season in the garden blooming, and the pollinators seem to recognize the flower, even though the height of the plant is severely different. Now, cultivars were introduced because they are genetic clones. And what that means is that each plant is an exact copy of the other plant. And some of our growers have done that because they want to be able to patent that plant, or they're trying to purposely breed it for a specific look to the flower or look to the leaf or petal. What I find in my own garden, where I planted a variegated Joe Pye weed several years ago, is that the monarchs were very unlikely to use it. In fact, I've only seen one butterfly on it in my entire time of living here, so I ripped it out this past season. Now, that was my preference. It was a pretty plant, don't get me wrong. But I've seen this as well at some of our native plant gardens that are trial gardens here in Pennsylvania. We have a wonderful garden near Rutgers University that has been repurposed into a native plant garden, and they're trialing all these different types of plants to see what the pollinator activity is going to be. So what I found though when I was there on a garden tour is that this particular phlox, which is a variegated phlox called Nora Lee, is very, very pretty, but wasn't being used by our pollinators. However, another garden which had a phlox Jenna Jenna is also a nativar. It has specifically been bred to reduce the amount of powdery mildew, which you and I as a gardener don't like the look of that. That plant had a lot of pollinator activity. So I have the straight species phlox, and in a more shady part of my garden, I have the phlox Jenna. And what I find is that the pollinators use both because the flower looks very much the same between the two different plants. So if you're interested in learning more about natives, nativars, and cultivars, I would encourage you to go to the Mount Cuba website. This is another native plant garden that has trial gardens, and each year they're trying new plants and they're actually recording the pollinator activity. What I will say is we don't want to demonize every non-native plant, but we do want to be able to say that on average, the native straight species is extremely attractive and most likely to survive in your environment. The nativar is great for those of you who like the look of that plant but maybe need a shorter, stockier plant to be able to be compliant with your homeowners association. And as a rule, not always, but as a rule, avoid the cultivar. The cultivar, while it looks pretty for you, if you want to grow it, know that you're not growing it for your pollinators, you're growing it for yourselves. If you found this video to be helpful, I would sincerely appreciate you making a comment down below. I would also like to know your feedback if you don't think it's helpful. That way we can make a special video to potentially address whatever concerns that you have in a following segment. Hope you're having a great day and garden thoughtfully. Take care.